So it looks as if once again we have to ask ourselves whether we can compare the United States of today with the Germany of the 1930s. And once again I have to say that while there is still hope that the US can step back from the brink, time is running out. I don't really want to have to talk about America because this channel is actually about Germany, but here we are in a situation where we really do need to learn the lessons of German history. Back in 2021, I said that the storming of the Capitol was not Donald Trump's Reichstag fire moment, it was his beer hall putsch moment. Well, now it's 2025 and I hate to say it, but I fear that this is the Reichstag fire moment. Now, things are developing very quickly at the moment, so there's a very real chance that this video will be outdated before I can even finish editing it. But with that caveat in mind, let's talk about what's happening now and then go on to talk about the Reichstag fire and what happened after that. The current situation began when ICE, whose job is to enforce immigration law, started conducting raids in Los Angeles looking for people to deport, apparently because they were under pressure from the Deputy Chief of Staff to fulfill some kind of quota. Locals began demonstrating, and unfortunately some of these demonstrations turned violent. Despite the fact that local police were easily able to contain this violence, the federal government ordered the National Guard to assist. And the detail to remember here is that the National Guard is supposed to be under the command of the state government. There is a provision allowing the federal government to take charge, but only in an extreme emergency, and even then, everything has to go through the governor. And even though the situation then calmed down considerably, the federal government continued to talk in terms of an insurrection, claiming that Los Angeles was essentially descending into violence, something which is demonstrably untrue. And it used that to also justify sending in hundreds of Marines in direct violation of federal law. With the government describing as insurrectionists, protesters who, for example, spit on police officers or wave Mexican flags, the fear is that the intention is to spread fear and anger among the general populace in order to provoke a violent reaction and so justify invoking emergency legislation to allow the use of military force to attack political opponents. Which is where we turn to history to talk about that fateful night on the 27th of February 1933, when a fire broke out in the Reichstag Building and completely gutted it. Hitler had been Chancellor for about a month at that point, but the government he was leading was in a state of collapse and the country was preparing for a new election. The fire was very clearly a case of arson, and the government was very quick to blame the communists. Goering announced that there was not a minute to lose because this was the start of the communist uprising. Hitler said that all communists should be hanged or shot on sight. And indeed, one man had already been arrested and had confessed to the crime, a 24-year-old Dutch communist called Marinus van der Lubbe, who claimed that he was working alone. But even at the time, there were doubts as to whether he had the intellectual capacity to pull off something like this without any help. It's widely suspected that he was either helped by the Nazis or actually innocent, but forced by the Nazis to confess. But we'll probably never know. A few years ago, his remains were exhumed and tested using modern forensic techniques, but no evidence was found that he had been drugged, which until that point had been one of the theories. But whoever actually started the fire and what their motives were isn't the point. The Nazis took this one incident and used it as an excuse to declare that a communist uprising was threatening to take over the country. And the very next day, they got the president to sign an emergency order. At the time, Article 48, paragraph 2 of the German Constitution allowed the president to take certain measures if they were necessary to restore public order and safety. In particular, certain constitutional rights could be temporarily restricted or even suspended for the duration of the crisis. The text lists 7 specific articles relating to such things as freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, protection from unreasonable searches and surveillance, and something similar to habeas corpus, which is the principle that if you are arrested, you have a right to know why, and you have the right to due process. This is an extremely crude piece of emergency legislation. It would be like giving the US president the power to unilaterally declare a state of emergency and suspend the Bill of Rights. Imagine, and I know this is difficult, but try to imagine it anyway, ICE agents being allowed to arrest, detain, and deport people without even a trial. Imagine a US senator being tackled to the ground and handcuffed simply because he tried to ask the Secretary of Homeland Security a question. There were some very basic protections in place. The Reichstag had to be informed immediately of the situation and had the power to veto the president's decree, or if it chose not to, it had to pass a law giving further details. On the 28th of February 1933, the Nazis presented to President Hindenburg an order for him to sign, which clearly violated Article 48 of the Constitution. It was called the Decree of the Reich President for the Protection of People and State, and Hindenburg signed it. Why was it clearly unconstitutional? Well, right at the start, Section 1 doesn't just suspend those suspendable articles that it needed to suspend in order to respond to a specific situation. It simply suspended all of them, and without explaining why. Now, that's not expressly forbidden by the Constitution, but it's not really what was supposed to happen. More importantly, it didn't give any kind of expiration date. No specific day on which these rights would automatically be restored. The decree simply says, until further notice. But most importantly, there was no national emergency serious enough to warrant such a decree. Now, don't get me wrong, arson is a crime, and there had been problems with violent confrontations in the Weimar Republic. And this was a very, very serious case. The Reichstag Building had been so badly damaged that debates had to be held in the Opera House next door. But there was no actual evidence of any real threat to the country itself, at least not one that couldn't be handled without ignoring a significant chunk of constitutional law. It was never established beyond a reasonable doubt that van der Lubbe was part of a wider conspiracy, and he always maintained right up until his death that he was acting alone. The decree went even further than that, though. It forced the states to obey the central government, stripping them of their autonomy. And not only that, but for good measure, it decreed that certain crimes which up until that point had been punishable by life in prison now carried the death penalty. As for informing the Reichstag, at the time there was no Reichstag to inform. It had already been dissolved ahead of the election. That also meant it couldn't pass the law that the Constitution demanded, and even after the election and after the new Reichstag had been inaugurated, no such law was ever passed, and neither was the decree repealed until after the Second World War. So now we have a government taking one criminal act as an excuse to declare an emergency, take away people's rights, and overrule the states, all without bothering about what the Legislative Assembly might have to say about the matter. This decree effectively gave the executive branch free hand to persecute its ideological enemies. Within 3 months, 100,000 people in Prussia alone had been imprisoned for their political beliefs, which is why it is extremely concerning to hear Trump say that the governor of California should be punished for the crime of running for office. For van der Lubbe himself, things were about to get a great deal worse. Remember how the decree applied the death penalty to certain crimes that previously had been punishable by life in prison? Well, about a month later, the new Reichstag passed a law applying this retroactively to the 31st of January 1933. This actually violated Article 116 of the Constitution, but the Nazis interpreted that article in a way that allowed them to argue that there was a loophole in the text. The law was passed specifically so that van der Lubbe, who was to be convicted of treason, could be executed, which ultimately he was. So let's recap. The government falsely claimed that the country was under attack, and on that basis, illegally invoked emergency legislation that severely restricted the rights of citizens and of the states. And as the smoke cleared after the Second World War, it was this that Germany vowed should never be allowed to happen ever again.